The first skiing rock carving is dated back 4,000 years old and is on the Norwegian island of Radoy. In fact, in Scandinavia, skiing is so much a religion that there's a skiing god and goddess, Ul and Skard. Why am I talking about skiing on my world building channel? Because, fellow world builders, sport. Sport can help you bring a culture to life. And that's what I want to discuss today. So I'm going to break down today's discussion into the purpose of sport, normal sport in fantasy, i.e., non magical sport, the impact of magic on sport, and then finally, I will take you through my process of creating a sport in a fantasy world. Before we get going, please do hit the subscribe button. It really does help the channel grow. Okay, let's get cracking. The original purpose of sport was to train people for war. And that is why a lot of our sports are things like throwing a discus, throwing a spear, running, chariot racing, etc. These things are all based around the art of war. The first Olympic Games was held by the Greeks in 776 BC. So that was sport for entertainment with a audience, as a spectator sport. Sport continued on into the classical period. The Romans, of course, famously had the Circus Maximus, where they had blood sport, very violent, but very entertaining, very big business sport. Of course, as the Roman Empire fell, feudalism rose in its place. Now, feudalism had a really weird impact on sport. And I bet you never heard those words strung together. So, feudalism is pretty much a pyramid structure. Yeah? It's a pyramid scheme that everybody buys into. Each lord has to provide soldiers to the lord above them. What happened in a feudal society is you needed to train your peasants in order to be able to provide those escalating layers of soldiers to the lords above you. And so sport reverted to largely training for war, which is why the medieval sports, the early medieval sports, are all jousting, fencing, archery, quarterstaff fighting, and all of these very martial, very militant sports. During the Renaissance, we had a resurgence again of more entertainment-based sports, team-based sports. The Renaissance is where volleyball was born as a sport. And then, of course, that progressed into our era, which is basically sport as big business. Given all of this, how do you incorporate sport into your fantasy world? First, let's talk about normal sport. Raymond Feist does a great job of showing us how to use normal sport in a fantasy world. So, even in the very early book, in Magician, he refers to a sport that the castle kids play called barrel ball, which involves two teams of boys running around kicking a leather ball into a barrel. It sounds a lot like soccer. A very early prototype form of soccer. And then as the books continue, as his world evolves, the game of barrel ball evolves. Eventually it gets rules, it gets a proper field, it gets referees, it becomes a thing that people bet on, it gets a net, and it's pretty much soccer in all but names. Soccer or football if you're European. That's an example of a classic team sport. If you want to discuss a more traditional middle-aged sport in fantasy, though, you have to talk about George R. R. Martin and the tournaments in Game of Thrones. So Martin actually does a great job of historically accurate tournaments. Jousting did have mystery nights in the beginning. It was only later where you had to prove your lineage in order to compete, as jousting became more popular, which of course is highlighted in the movie A Knight's Tale, which is quite an accurate look at it. at jousting and tournament life. Now, the important thing about tournament life is that it was also an occasion of politics and pomp and ceremony. There were a lot of things tied into jousting that was more than just the sport. It was a very popular thing to watch. It was a very popular thing to participate in and to gain honor in. So, those are two examples of well done normal sports, non-magical sports in a fantasy world. But what about magical sports? What if you want to show magic in your sports? I have to talk about Quidditch. I mean, it has to be done, right? So J.K. Rowling's Quidditch from Harry Potter is actually a phenomenal example of a magical sport. It involves things that we can relate to, like throwing a ball through a hoop. This is a very natural seeming sport. It highlights the primary magical ability of her protagonist, which is Harry's flying ability. It gives us a tie in to his parents, in that his father was also a Quidditch player. The whole setup of Quidditch is just excellent for its world. Another great example of sport in a fantasy setting, magical sport, is of course pro bending from the Legend of Korra, where you've got benders participating in small teams of 3 against each other and trying to push each other off a platform, which also makes sense to us if you're looking for a more military training style of magical sport, because Quidditch is very much like a big business style of sports. So pro bending would be more like that military training style of magical sport. In my world, I needed a sport to introduce one of my Lancer character, my secondary character. And he's a very militantly adept character, very combat capable character. So I wanted to introduce him by means of a tournament. And at first I went with a classic Lance style, jousting tournament. But I kept thinking that I was missing a trick here. And so I invented a magical sport. I called it Elias, and it's played on a field that is divided into 3s. In each third, there are 5 poles of varying lengths. And what I wanted to show off in this sport is the anime nature of my magic system, right? Because in my magic system, Habirs, which is what they're called when they use this form of the magic, can alter their bodies, so they can make themselves stronger. They can make their limbs a little longer. They can grasp things. So it's all kind of internally focused magic. And so I wanted to highlight that and illustrate that through the sport. So they have these poles to provide them with vertical surfaces. So they jump onto the poles and then they fight each other, by jumping across to each other's pole, by swinging around their poles, by trying to throw each other off the poles, by hitting each other while they're in midair. And it provides, in my head anyway, a very anime style of combat, which I think introduces my Lancer much, much better than my original jousting tournament. But how do you actually create a fantasy sport? Like, what is your actual mechanic? The first thing that you have to ask yourself is, do you want a magical sport or not? Okay? If the answer is, I don't want a magical sport, then look at history, decide whether you want a solo sport or a team sport, and take one of the historical sports and make it your own. There are great examples in history. Hockey was played by the early Egyptians, so obviously a very early form of hockey. So a sport involving a stick and a ball, you're probably gonna, create a fairly decent sport. Maybe you want to go with something involving weapons. You want a little bit more of a military training sport. If you look at a movie called Salute of the Jugger, it's a terrible movie, but the sport is a lot of fun. and is used by people who LARP the world over. We used it when we created a LARPing world called Tales of Tiana. There was a sport called Jugger that people played in professional teams, and it involves weapons and a ball sport. So it's like the best of all worlds. So if you want to have a normal sport, pick something from history. If you want a magical sport, think about what you want to highlight. Okay? What is the thing about your magic system that you want to highlight? I wanted to highlight the anime style of my magic system, the jumping from surfaces. J.K. Rowling highlighted the flying from her magic systems on brooms. In Pro Bending, they highlight the push and pull of the benders and the raw power involved in bending. So think about that and decide what you want to highlight. Then set up your field of play to accommodate that. Yeah, the reason why I have these poles is because I wanted vertical surfaces for people to be able to show off their magic. The reason why the Quidditch hoops are on poles is so that you have to fly to get there. I mean, it sounds obvious, but it highlights what J.K. Rowling was trying to illustrate with the sport. So set up your field to match what you want to highlight. Decide whether it's a team or solo. If it's a team, decide on your team size. You probably want to aim for a team size between 10 and 5. Anything larger than 10, people lose track of the players. Anything smaller than 5, it's more a group of individuals cooperating rather than an actual team. Just a side note on team sizes. Add the accoutrements that make sense to your sport. By that I mean J.K. Rowling added balls, I added weapons. In Pro Bending, they added access to the elements. That's why there's holes in the Pro Bending arena that give you access to the water. There are those discs that the earthbenders throw that gives them access to earth, and so on. Your accoutrements of your sport. And then finally, and I know this sounds really obvious, but decide how you're going to score, how you're going to win, and how your refereeing works. Okay? So I ended up setting up you yield system, or you have to use your own magic to heal yourself to continue. And the reason why I did that was because I couldn't figure out where to put a ref on my field. So give some thought to how you score and where a referee would stand in your magical sport. And that's my take on creating sport for a fantasy world. I hope you sport well in the future. Comment below, let me know what you think about sport in fantasy and where you've seen it done well. And I will see you on Tuesday for another episode of Just in Time World.